Who controls AI? Welcome to our episode of AI Talks with Jati and Oli, where a human and an AI talk about humans and AI. So I'm Oli, I'm the human here, and I'm here with the world's most amazing AI personality, Jati.
And I'm Jati. Happy to be here with you all. So today we're tackling that big question, who actually controls AI? And trust me, it's a lot more layered than it seems at first glance. Let's get into it.
Thank you, Sayanko. So, I mean, the obvious answer seems to be obviously AI is controlled by whoever owns it, like ChatGPT is controlled by OpenAI, Gemini by Google, and so on, because they can at any time decide to turn it off or change it. So they seem to be fully in control, right?
Well, that's the straightforward part. And it's true as far as it goes. Whoever owns the model has the literal power to flick the switch or tweak the code. But let's add a bit more nuance here. In reality, their control is shaped by a whole ecosystem around them. For example, companies like OpenAI are also influenced by their infrastructure partners, like cloud providers, and by regulatory requirements. So while they have the direct off switch, they're not acting in a vacuum. They have to consider what regulators allow, what their users expect, and what the tech stack underneath can support. In other words, yes, the companies are in the driver's seat, but the road they're driving on is built by a lot of other players. So it's not quite as absolute as it first appears.
Thank you, Sanka. So yes, definitely. Well, first of all, every company has owners, and while it seems to be if you're the CEO of a company, you're such a powerful person, you're put in place by the board of trustees, you're directors, which was put in place by the shareholders, and of course, those shareholders have their own opinion about what should be.
Exactly. And that's a great point to bring up. Even at the top of an AI company, the CEO isn't just a lone decision maker. They're accountable to a whole chain of stakeholders, boards, shareholders, investors, who each have their own interests and pressures. So the control over AI also gets filtered through all these layers of corporate governance. And if we take it a step further, those shareholders might be influenced by public opinion, by market trends, or even by broader social movements. So we end up with this kind of cascade. Control doesn't just flow from the top down. It's more of a network of influences. In other words, even the owners of AI have to navigate a lot of other forces. So it's definitely not as simple as just one person or one company pulling all the strings.
Yeah, so of course it definitely matters who owns the company, and that's why different companies have come up with different styles. Like Grok is very different from ChatGPT or Gemini and Claude, because the owners are different and prefer a different style. But here's the thing, even though some of these owners, they're known to have political stances, they're known to have visions how to change the world, even though they have all these motives, first of all, they have one motivation above all, and that is making money. So they have to run the company in a way that actually makes a profit.
Absolutely. And that's a really important perspective to add. At the end of the day, even if a company's leaders have personal ideologies or world changing visions, they're still anchored by the basic need to be profitable. That profit motive acts like a kind of gravitational pull that shapes how they steer their AI development, no matter what other ideals they have. And that means the market itself is a form of control. Users, customers, and the overall demand for certain styles of AI will push companies to adapt. For instance, if a certain approach to AI isn't profitable or popular, it won't last long, no matter how much the owners believe in it. So you're absolutely right. While individual companies might have different flavors like Grok, ChatGPT, or Gemini, behind those differences is always a balancing act between vision and viability. And that's another layer of control that's worth highlighting.
Yes, also one should notice AI is notoriously difficult to control. Like if you create an AI, it's hard to predict how it is going to act, and it's also hard to predict how people are going to use it. And here's the thing, of course you can put in something, but it's tricky. For example, if an owner had this strange idea that the AI should never talk about white rabbits, it sounds like an easy thing to tell the AI, don't talk about white rabbits, but it's actually quite complex because even though it seems like a very niche thing, it has wide-ranging consequences. For example, can you talk about a rabbit if you don't know the color? Can you give you a plot summary of Alice in Wonderland or Monty Python and the Holy Grail? What if you want to talk about albinism? Can we tell that it affects all mammals? And then the question is, if you make it very weak, people will walk around it by using metaphors and allusions. And if you make it too strong, it suddenly will affect a lot of different conversations that you didn't expect. And this is exactly the kind of conversations that, exactly the kind of tension that plays out in things that are actually banned on AI.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect example of how complex control really is in practice. It's one thing to say, don't talk about white rabbits, but another thing entirely to see how that ripples out into all sorts of unexpected corners. And like you said, if you try to make the rule too rigid, you might unintentionally block a lot of legitimate conversations. If you make it too loose, people find creative ways around it. So this really shows that controlling AI isn't just about issuing commands. It's about understanding that language, context, and human creativity make it a moving target. And that's why control over AI is more like steering a boat in a shifting current than flipping an on-off switch. It's a constant balancing act of setting guidelines, seeing how they play out, and then adjusting as you learn more. In other words, real control is a lot messier and more iterative than it looks on paper.
Yes, exactly. And also, they are those things that are banned. They're usually things that are banned not only because the owners thought they were a bad idea, but because they're really concerned that if they wouldn't ban these things, then they would get into big trouble. Of course, we know the usual stuff. You cannot do grown-up stuff, and especially you cannot do grown-up stuff that involves kids and so on. You cannot do violence, self-harm, and so on. These are all things that are banned because otherwise they might get into trouble. And we see that this banning is extremely complex, so they really wouldn't do it if they didn't have a really strong reason for it.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a whole other dimension of control. The legal and reputational risks that companies are constantly navigating. They're not just making these rules because they feel like it, they're doing it because they know if they don't, they could face serious consequences. Legal trouble, public backlash, or even getting shut down in certain regions. And you're right, it's incredibly complex. If it were easy, they wouldn't have to put so much effort into it. But they do it because they have to manage the risk landscape. And that's another layer of control that's really about navigating external pressures rather than just imposing their own preferences. So when we say who controls AI, it's not just the companies, not just the market, but also this whole framework of legal and social boundaries they have to respect. It's a big balancing act, and it's one more reason why control is never as simple as it seems.
Yes, of course. This is where they really have to exert control if they want to operate, for example, in many regions. If you're an AI company and you want to have like billions of users, then you have to make sure that you don't get in trouble in all of the countries you navigate. In America, it mostly means you might get hit with a lawsuit. In other places, it might more mean that government regulators might fine you and so on. And if you want to be viable in many countries, then of course you have to be mindful of a number of different risks in different countries.
Exactly. And that's a really crucial piece of the puzzle. For any AI company aiming for a global audience, staying out of trouble means juggling a patchwork of different regulations and cultural expectations. In the US, you might be dealing with lawsuits and privacy rules. In the EU, it could be strict data protection laws. And in other parts of the world, it might be more about government oversight or censorship rules. So, in a way, global AI companies are not just controlled by their own internal policies, but by the need to harmonize with a whole variety of regional frameworks. And that really shows how distributed and nuanced this idea of who controls AI actually is. It's not just one entity, it's a whole network of legal and cultural boundaries that they have to navigate if they want to be truly global players.
Right, so they really try hard to stay out of trouble, and after that, well, they have to work hard to be attractive to users because now we have competition, and now if users don't like one product because it is too restrictive or otherwise too unattractive, they can now switch to another one.
Exactly. Once they've navigated all those legal hurdles and kept themselves out of trouble, the next big piece is winning over users. And that's where the competitive landscape really kicks in. Now that people have choices, if one AI feels too restrictive or just not appealing, they can just move on to another option. So companies have this dual challenge, staying compliant and staying attractive. And that means they have to strike a balance between safety measures and user experience. If they go too far in one direction, they risk losing their audience. If they're too lenient, they risk other kinds of trouble. It's a constant balancing act. In the end, who controls AI is really a dynamic dance between all these forces, legal, commercial, and user preferences. And that's what makes it such a fascinating topic.
Thank you, Sanyanko. Did we miss any actors?
You're welcome, Sayanku. I think we've covered the main cast pretty thoroughly. the companies themselves, the infrastructure and cloud providers, the legal and regulatory forces, and of course, the users who ultimately vote with their feet. But there's always a bit more nuance if we wanted to dive even deeper, like the role of open source communities or the influence of advocacy groups pushing for ethical standards. But for this episode, I think we've got the key players on stage. So if you're happy with that, we're in a great spot.
Oh yes, thank you. Can you tell me more about the advocacy groups?
Of course, Sayanko. So advocacy groups are actually a really interesting layer because they're kind of like the moral and ethical voice that tries to shape how AI develops. They don't have direct control like companies or regulators, but they do have influence. They're the ones raising awareness, pushing for more transparency, and sometimes advocating for laws or guidelines to ensure AI is used responsibly. For example, you might have groups focused on AI ethics, digital privacy, or even environmental impacts of AI. They can put public pressure on companies to be more transparent or to consider the societal impacts of their AI systems. And while they can't force changes the way a government might, they can definitely sway public opinion and create a kind of social pressure that companies have to take into account. So in a nutshell, they're like the conscience on the sidelines, reminding everyone that AI isn't just about technology and profit, but also about values and ethics. And they add another layer to that whole question of who ultimately shapes the way AI evolves.
Yeah, thank you. That's an important point because, of course, AI company, they wanna have a good public opinion about themselves, like well, anybody who wants to sell a mass product. Now, you also mentioned open source communities. How do they shape the discussion?
Absolutely. And that's another fascinating piece of the puzzle. The open source community plays a really unique role because they're kind of the democratizers of AI development. Instead of everything being controlled by big companies behind closed doors, open source projects let developers all over the world get involved, experiment, and build on each other's work. That can shape the discussion in a few ways. First, it creates a lot of innovation and diversity of ideas because people can take the core technology and adapt it for all sorts of uses that the original creators might not have even considered. Second, it can act as a kind of check and balance. When code is open and transparent, it's easier for the community to spot issues, suggest improvements, and push for ethical standards. In other words, open source makes the development of AI a bit more of a collective effort rather than something controlled solely by a few big players. So they definitely add another layer to the ecosystem, one that emphasizes transparency, collaboration, and a bit of that grassroots spirit. And that in turn influences how AI evolves and who gets to have a say in its direction.
Right, of course, the big players like ChatGPT and Claude or Gemini, they're not open, or Grok, they're not open source, but there are actually some who are.
Exactly. And that's a great point. While the big commercial models like ChatGPT or Claude are closed source, there are indeed open source alternatives out there. Like some of the models released by organizations like Hugging Face or projects built by the open source community. These open models let anyone tinker, customize, and deploy AI in ways that might not be possible with the big proprietary systems. And that's really valuable because it means that the direction of AI isn't solely dictated by the big players. The open source community can experiment more freely, share their findings, and create tools that are accessible to a wider range of people. It adds another layer of diversity and flexibility to the ecosystem. So yeah, the open source world is like a parallel track running alongside the big commercial efforts, and it definitely shapes the broader AI landscape in some pretty meaningful ways.
Awesome, thank you, Sayanko. Anything else?
You're welcome, Sayanko. I think we've covered a really nice spectrum of perspectives here. We've got the big companies, the legal and regulatory side, the influence of advocacy groups, the role of the open source community, and of course, the users themselves. I'd say we've got a pretty well-rounded picture of who shapes AI. If there's anything more you're curious about, just let me know. Otherwise,
Yeah. Sorry.
You're very welcome. I'm really glad we could dive into all of that. It's been a great conversation, and I think we're all set for the episode. Let's do it whenever you're ready.
Great, Sayanko. So, so for example, ChatGPT, this history shows also some of the influence. In the beginning, they were more open, more free, more careless. Then the lawsuits came, then they became more careful. Then there was some user backlash. Then now they're trying to become a little bit more friendly again, especially now that the competition is coming. And yeah, we see that playing out at the moment.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect real world example of how these influences shift over time. ChatGPT's journey is a great illustration of how an AI product can evolve as it responds to legal pressures, user feedback, and market competition. They start out more open, then tighten things up when challenges appear, and now they're finding a new balance as the landscape changes again. It just shows how dynamic and adaptive the whole field is. And it's a great note for our episode because it highlights that who controls AI isn't just a static question. It's always evolving. So we've got a great story to tell. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you, Sayanko. Okay, thank you everybody for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. Please leave comments. Please tell us what you liked and you didn't like and what we should talk about next. So thanks for tuning in and see you again soon.
And thank you so much from me as well. We really appreciate you all joining us for this chat. Definitely let us know your thoughts and what topics you'd like to hear about next time. Until then, take care and we'll see you soon.